The world did not begin in light. That is the lie the heavens like to tell, the kind of lie that sounds clean when spoken from marble balconies, the kind that turns history into a hymn and hunger into a footnote. On the earth below, the first ages were not gilded. They were damp and raw, stitched together by cold and fear, by the thin, trembling patience of creatures who had not yet learned the difference between darkness and death. Night came early then, as if the sky itself were impatient with the unfinished. Shadows spilled into valleys like ink, swallowing paths, swallowing faces, swallowing the fragile certainty that a morning would ever return. The wind wandered wherever it pleased and made a sport of extinguishing hope in breath after breath. Rain fell not as blessing, but as reminder that warmth was a rare animal, that comfort was a luxury, that the world belonged to whatever could endure it. And the mortals, those new, soft-handed children of the earth, endured because there was nothing else to do. They huddled in caves whose mouths resembled the open jaws of beasts. They wrapped themselves in skins that still remembered the warmth of other lives. They watched the sky with the expression of those who expect to be punished and cannot name the sin. When thunder rolled, they flinched as if struck. When lightning tore the clouds, they looked away, not in awe but in terror, because the heavens spoke only in violence. They had no fire, not the living kind, not the kind that stays, not the kind that can be coaxed into obedience and made to serve, only the brief, cruel flash of lightning, the momentary betrayal of light that vanished as quickly as it appeared, leaving the world darker for having been reminded of what it lacked. Without fire, time was a predator. Food was whatever could be swallowed quickly before it spoiled, whatever could be torn raw from the world with bleeding fingers. Winter was not a season, it was a sentence. The weak did not survive long enough to become old. The brave died early, not because courage is punished, but because courage tends to stand up when it should crouch. Mothers learned to sing softly, not to soothe their children, but to keep wolves from hearing them. And when the wolves came anyway, the songs changed into silence, because silence was sometimes the only mercy the night allowed. Those who lived did not live well. They lived desperately, the way a candle might live if it were also afraid of being aflame. Still, in the midst of that bleakness, something stubborn moved inside them, something that did not belong to the earth's cruelty and did not bow to the sky's indifference. They looked at the stars, those distant, glittering witnesses, and imagined meaning. They watched a dying branch spark when struck by lightning and imagined control. They saw the way warmth gathered around that brief blaze and imagined that the world might be negotiated with, if only they could learn the language. They named gods because naming is what mortals do when they cannot bear the shapelessness of fear. They placed offerings at stones and whispered into trees and begged the night to be kind. But the night was never kind. Olympus watched, not as a mother watches a sleeping child, not as a shepherd watches a flock, but as a ruler watches a border alert, calculating, distant. The gods were not cruel in the way mortals are cruel. They had no need to be. Their cruelty was structural, effortless, built into the architecture of their power. They ruled because they could. They withheld because they chose. They called it law because the word sounded better than appetite. Zeus, whose throne was a mountain of storm and certainty, had remade the cosmos in his own image. Hierarchy, command, consequence. The Titans had once been the old gravity of the world, ancient forces that held the universe in their slow hands. But Zeus had broken them and called that victory justice, had scattered them into pits and chains and distant exile. And now the new order stood bright and sharp like a freshly forged blade. To Olympus, the mortals were neither enemy nor ally. They were a condition of the world, like weather, like tides, like the dust that gathers inevitably on every surface, no matter how divine the room. Some gods found them amusing, small as insects, loud as birds. Some found them useful, capable of building temples and singing praises, feeding the gods with the sweetest food of all, attention. But none, not truly, considered them worthy of light. Fire, after all, was not merely heat. Fire was a key. Fire was the beginning of mastery, and mastery was always dangerous to those who sat at the top of a pyramid built from ignorance. The gods kept fire close, not because it was scarce, but because it was potent. It glowed in their halls and contained braziers that never smoked, in torches that never dimmed, in hearths that never needed tending. It was effortless there, obedient, as if it recognized the authority of those who owned the sky. In Olympus, warmth was decoration. In the mortal world, warmth was salvation. Between those two truths stood Prometheus. He did not stand in the way a soldier stands, with armor and banners. He stood the way a shadow stands at the edge of light, present, uncelebrated, difficult to ignore if one pays attention, easy to forget if one refuses. His name had been spoken in the age of Titans with respect, with suspicion, with the uneasy gratitude reserved for those who see too far. He was a Titan by birth, yes, but not by temperament. His mind had always been sharper than the blunt pride of his kind. He had watched his brethren swell with certainty, and believed quietly that certainty was a kind of blindness. He had watched Zeus rise, and did not mistake youth for weakness. He had chosen, when the universe cracked open, to stand with the new order, not out of worship, not out of loyalty, but because he understood that the future would belong to the one who could shape it. And Zeus was a sculptor with thunder in his hands. That choice had saved Prometheus from the abyss that swallowed so many titans. But salvation is not the same as belonging. Olympus did not embrace him. It tolerated him. Zeus did not love him. He used him. Prometheus was too valuable to discard, and too dangerous to trust. A mind that moved like fire itself, looking for air, looking for fuel. So Prometheus lingered in the margins of divinity, a guest in the halls of gods, an exile from the age of giants, a creature whose immortality felt less like a gift and more like a long sentence without a clear crime. His gaze drifted downward often. The gods rarely looked at the earth unless it screamed. Prometheus looked even when it whispered. He watched mortals stumble through their brief lives, watched them search for patterns in chaos, watched them bring stones together and call it shelter, watched them turn grief into ritual, because ritual was the only thing that made grief bearable. He watched the way they protected their young, with bodies that could be broken, watched the way they shared food even when it meant hunger later, watched them love in a world that gave no promises. Their fragility did not disgust him. It haunted him. In the silence between thunderstorms, Prometheus found himself thinking not of Olympus's triumph, but of the earth's struggle. And something in him, a thing older than politics, older than pride, began to lean toward that struggle, as if drawn by gravity. It was not pity. Pity is shallow, and Prometheus had never been shallow. It was recognition. The mortals were unfinished, yes, but unfinished things can become anything. Olympus was finished, perfected, trapped inside its own completion. The gods were immortal, and immortality breeds complacency like rot breeds flies. Mortals were brief, and brevity breeds urgency, and urgency breeds invention. Prometheus could almost see it, like a faint outline behind the veil of the present. If given the smallest tool, the smallest spark, these trembling creatures would change the world. That was what frightened Zeus. Zeus called it disorder. Prometheus called it possibility. In Olympus, possibility was a threat. The king of gods liked his universe stable, predictable, obedient. He liked it arranged like a court, with himself at the center and everything else orbiting as if grateful. So he set rules, and the gods pretended the rules were natural law, not policy. Fire would not be given. Knowledge would not be shared. Mortals would remain small. Fear would keep them kneeling. Those were the pillars of peace, Zeus said, and his voice made it sound almost holy. Prometheus listened, as he always did, and said little, because argument was a fire that burned outward and drew attention, and Prometheus was learning that attention was the most dangerous kind of light. Instead, he watched. He listened. He stored truths the way the earth stores seeds, waiting for the right season. And in the deep places of his mind, where even gods could not reach without permission, a question began to shape itself, slow and deliberate, the way rivers carve stone. What is the purpose of power, if not to lift what is weak? What is the worth of divinity, if it hoards the very thing that could make the world less cruel? Prometheus did not ask these questions aloud. Olympus had little patience for questions that did not end with praise. But questions, once born, do not die easily. And Prometheus had always been the kind of being who carried his questions like hidden weapons. Down on earth, the night fell again. And again mortals huddled together. And again the cold made their bones ache. And again they stared at the sky and prayed to gods who did not answer. Olympus remained warm. Olympus remained bright. Olympus remained indifferent. Prometheus stood at a window of marble and gold and watched the dark swallow the world. And for a moment, only a moment, he imagined what a single steady flame could do down there. Imagined the way it would push back the shadows. Imagined the way it would teach human hands that the universe can be held, negotiated with, commanded. He imagined, and in that imagining, he felt something shift, something quiet but irrevocable, like the first crack in ice before a river breaks free. In the distance, thunder muttered, a reminder of Zeus's presence, of Zeus's reach. Prometheus did not flinch. He only watched the mortal world breathe in the dark, and he began to understand that some rebellions are not born from anger, but from love so severe it becomes dangerous. Watching is an underestimated act. The gods of Olympus preferred action thunder hurled, laws declared, enemies crushed beneath decisive force. But Prometheus had learned long ago that watching, truly watching, was where the universe revealed its secrets. Action changes what is. Observation explains why it changes. From the high terraces of Olympus, where the air thinned into something sharp and metallic, Prometheus watched the mortal world as one might watch a slow-burning wound, not with morbid fascination, but with the quiet dread that comes from understanding the damage will deepen before it heals. He watched the seasons turn like a wheel with broken spokes, predictable in motion, yet merciless in effect. He watched winter hollow out entire valleys and summer scorch fields into dust. He watched the way mortals adapted, not by conquering nature, but by negotiating with it, learning its moods, memorizing its cruelty, finding narrow windows in which survival was possible. The gods called this persistence insignificant. Prometheus did not. He saw intelligence in the way humans learned, where storms gathered, where rivers flooded, where animals migrated. He saw memory forming, fragile and incomplete, passed from mouth to mouth, from scar to scar. He saw a species teaching itself, slowly, painfully, without tools, without light, without mercy. Olympus did not lack for opinions about mortals. Athena admired their potential for strategy, but dismissed their impatience. Apollo found them amusing when they sang, tiresome when they cried. Hera ignored them unless they interfered with divine pride. Ares laughed at how easily they broke. Zeus thought of them as an experiment, interesting, flawed, disposable if necessary. Prometheus alone refused to compress them into metaphor. He saw them as they were, beings caught between awareness and helplessness, capable of imagining more than they could achieve, condemned to understand their own fragility without possessing the means to overcome it. That awareness, Prometheus knew, was the cruelest gift of all. Ignorance can be comfortable. Knowledge without power is torture. Prometheus himself had lived long enough to recognize the shape of that torture. He remembered the age before Zeus, before Olympus hardened into law, when the universe was raw and undecided, when Titans shaped mountains and oceans with careless hands and called it creation. He remembered how little foresight his kind had possessed, how they mistook strength for permanence, how they believed that because they could not imagine their own end, it would never arrive. Prometheus had imagined it. He had seen the cracks forming long before Kronos fell, long before thunder learned to speak with authority. That was why he had sided with Zeus, not because Zeus was just, but because Zeus was inevitable. Survival, Prometheus had learned, often requires aligning oneself with inevitability, even when it comes dressed as tyranny. That choice had saved him, but it had also isolated him. Zeus trusted Prometheus's mind, but never his heart. Olympus valued his counsel, but never his presence. He was invited to councils and excluded from loyalty, allowed to speak, but not to belong. Watching mortals sharpened that isolation. The more Prometheus observed them, the more he recognized a reflection of himself. Beings who stood at the edge of a greater power, tolerated but constrained, permitted to exist but not to transform. Mortals were forbidden fire. Prometheus was forbidden's influence. Both were expected to accept these limits as natural. Limits, Prometheus knew, were rarely natural. They were imposed, maintained, defended. On the earth below, a storm rolled across a plain. Lightning ripping the sky opened for a heartbeat before sealing it again. Prometheus watched as a tree ignited, flames licking upward in frantic beauty, and watched mortals approach with fear and awe. They did not know how to keep it alive. They did not know how to feed it. When the rain came, the fire died, and something in the humans died with it, not hope, exactly, but certainty. They had seen what was possible, and possibility, once glimpsed, is never harmless. Prometheus felt a familiar tightening in his chest, a pressure that had nothing to do with breath. The gods believed themselves immune to longing, but that was another lie Olympus told itself. Prometheus longed, not for worship, not for power, but for coherence. He wanted the world to make sense, to align with its own potential. A universe that allowed intelligence to exist, but denied it the tools to act was, to him, a flawed design. He wondered sometimes whether the cosmos itself was unfinished, whether even the gods were merely provisional solutions to a larger problem. Such thoughts were dangerous. Dangerous thoughts were his specialty. Zeus's voice echoed often in Prometheus's memory, not in anger, but in certainty. The king of gods had a talent for making his decisions sound like gravity, inevitable and impersonal. Mortals must remain weak, Zeus had said, because strength would make them unruly. Knowledge must remain divine, because shared power is diluted power. Fear must remain constant, because fear creates obedience without negotiation. Prometheus understood the logic. He simply rejected the conclusion. Obedience, he believed, was not peace. It was stagnation mistaken for stability. He had watched Titans rule through brute force, and watched that era collapse under its own weight. He watched Zeus rule through law and spectacle, and suspected quietly that this too would one day fracture. The difference was time. Olympus thought in eternities. Prometheus thought in trajectories. He saw where fear-led order always ended. Rebellion, collapse, renewal. Mortals would rebel eventually, with or without fire. The only question was how much suffering would precede that inevitability. Sometimes Prometheus wondered whether Zeus knew this and chose cruelty anyway, or whether even the king of gods was trapped by the throne he sat upon, compelled to enforce a system he no longer questioned. Power, Prometheus had learned, is often a prison disguised as elevation. He walked the halls of Olympus like a ghost, present in form, but distant in spirit. He listened as gods debated trivialities, whose temple was grander, whose city offered better sacrifices, whose name was sung more sweetly by mortal lips. Prometheus listened and thought of children shivering in caves, of elders dying because wisdom could not warm bones, of entire tribes erased by winter because no one had learned how to command flame. The contrast was obscene. It gnawed at him, not like anger, but like erosion. Stone does not shatter from erosion. It wears away until collapse becomes inevitable. Prometheus began to ask himself not whether intervention was right, but whether inaction was. The gods framed morality as obedience to divine law. Prometheus framed it as responsibility proportional to power. If one has the ability to reduce suffering and chooses not to, is that not also a choice? Zeus would say no. Zeus would say that suffering builds character, that mortals exist to struggle, that ease breeds weakness. Prometheus had watched mortals struggle enough to know that suffering is not ennoble by default. It simply consumes. Only when paired with possibility does struggle become growth. Fire was possibility. Fire was leverage against an indifferent world. Fire would not make mortals gods, no matter what Zeus feared. It would make them dangerous in a different way, dangerous to inevitability. Prometheus understood the risk. He understood that fire would bring not only warmth, but war. Not only art, but cruelty refined. Not only shelter, but cities capable of erasing each other. He saw all of it, the full arc of human potential, from tenderness to atrocity, from poetry to genocide. The knowledge did not stop him. If anything, it sharpened his resolve. A being capable of such extremes deserved the chance to choose between them. Choice, Prometheus believed, was the true mark of intelligence. To deny choice was to deny meaning. Late in the eternal afternoon of Olympus, Prometheus stood alone, watching the sun lower itself toward the horizon of the mortal world. Light pooled in valleys one last time before surrendering to shadow. Somewhere below, a mother would pull her child closer, preparing for the cold. Somewhere, a hunter would gamble his life against darkness. Somewhere, a story would be told in whispers, a story about gods who lived in the sky and controlled the storm. Default text Prometheus wondered what kind of god he was becoming in those stories. A distant watcher, perhaps, or a name forgotten altogether. The thought did not trouble him. Legacy mattered less than consequence. In the quiet, he acknowledged a truth he had been circling for ages. He could no longer remain only a witness. Watching had taught him enough. The universe, he realized, does not change because someone understands it. It changes because someone acts on that understanding. Prometheus turned away from the view, from the darkening earth, from the comforting lie of distance. In his mind, the question that had been forming finally settled into certainty. If the gods would not share fire, then fire would be taken. Not in rage, not in spectacle, but with precision, with intent, with full knowledge of the cost. Prometheus did not mistake this resolve for heroism. Heroes seek praise. He expected chains. He expected pain. He expected eternity to narrow into suffering. None of that deterred him. Some truths, once seen, demand to be embodied. Prometheus had seen too much to remain still. Olympus did not sleep. It only paused between proclamations, between judgments that rearranged the lives of gods and mortals alike with the casual grace of those who never had to clean up the aftermath. The air above the mountain was always charged, threaded with a low, constant tension like a held breath. And Prometheus felt it keenly as he approached the inner halls where Zeus held council. Thunder did not roar there. It loitered, coiled, and patient, an unspoken reminder of who defined silence and who merely inhabited it. Zeus sat upon his throne, not as a tyrant lounges, but as gravity settles, inevitable, unchallenged, heavy with the assurance of permanence. Gold and stone framed him like punctuation marks in a sentence the universe had already agreed to finish. Around him gathered the lesser gods, each carrying their own reflections of his authority. Athena's sharpened focus, Hera's cold vigilance, Apollo's polished distance. Prometheus entered without ceremony. He had long ago learned that bows invited expectations he did not intend to fulfill. Zeus regarded him with the expression of a ruler assessing a tool valuable, sharp, and best kept within reach, but never allowed to decide where it cut. "You watch the world too closely," Zeus said, his voice smooth, unhurried, as if observation itself were a minor infraction. Prometheus did not deny it. "Someone must," he replied, and felt the faint ripple his words caused among the assembled gods. Zeus's gaze did not shift. "The world functions well enough without constant scrutiny," the king of gods answered. "Mortals survive. They worship. The balance holds." Prometheus tilted his head slightly, a gesture that could be read as respect or doubt, depending on the observer's courage. "Survival is not the same as living," he said, "and balance maintained by fear is not balance. It is suspension." Zeus smiled then, not with warmth, but with the patience of one who has heard naivete before and intends to outlast it. "Fear is efficient," Zeus said. "It teaches quickly. It does not argue. Mortals understand fear. It keeps them small, and small things are easier to protect from themselves." Athena's eyes flicked toward Prometheus, curious rather than hostile. She had always understood the value of tools, and ideas were tools of a dangerous kind. Prometheus met Zeus's gaze steadily. "Small things break easily," he said, "and when they break, they shatter unpredictably." Zeus leaned forward, the air thickening as if the mountain itself were listening. "You speak as though mortals are entitled to more," Zeus said. "Entitlement breeds rebellion. Rebellion breeds chaos. I ended chaos. That is the purpose of my reign." Prometheus felt the weight of that statement, felt the echo of the titanometry in its syllables, the memory of a universe torn apart by unchecked force. He did not dismiss it. He refined it. "You ended one chaos," he said. "You replaced it with order enforced by fear. The difference is aesthetic, not structural." A murmur passed through the hall. Hera's lips tightened. Apollo looked away, as if suddenly interested in a column. Zeus's eyes narrowed, but his voice remained calm. "Order enforced by fear is order," Zeus said. "It endures. Mortals do not need the illusion of freedom. They need boundaries. Fire would erase those boundaries." Prometheus allowed himself a breath. "Fire would redraw them," he said. "There is a difference." Zeus rose. The movement was subtle, but the effect was immediate, like the first tremor before an earthquake. "You mistake mercy for wisdom," Zeus said. "Fire is not warmth alone. It is hunger sharpened. It is ambition given teeth. Mortals will not use it to comfort one another. They will use it to conquer." Prometheus did not flinch. "They already conquer," he said. "They conquer each other with stone and bone and bare hands. Fire will not invent cruelty. It will only make it visible." Zeus descended the steps of his throne until they stood closer, power pressing against foresight like opposing currents. "And when they turn that fire upward?" Zeus asked softly. "When they build towers and weapons and dreams large enough to challenge even us? What then?" Prometheus answered without hesitation. "Then they will have earned the right to be answered," he said. Silence followed, heavy and electric. Zeus studied him, truly studied him now, not as a counselor, not as a survivor of a lost age, but as a variable that threatened to disrupt a system carefully calibrated. "You speak of rights as if the universe were a court," Zeus said. "Rights are granted by those who can enforce them." Prometheus nodded. "That is precisely the problem," he said. Zeus turned away, signaling the end of the exchange, but his voice lingered like a blade drawn halfway from its sheath. "You assume I rule because I fear rebellion," Zeus said. "I rule because rebellion destroys what it claims to improve. I rule because someone must decide where the line is drawn." Prometheus watched the king of gods reclaim his throne, watched the court resume its quiet orbit around authority, and felt a clarity settle within him, sharp and cold. Zeus was not ignorant. Zeus was not blind. Zeus understood exactly what fire would do. That understanding did not restrain him. It justified him. The law of Olympus was not morality. It was preservation of control. As Prometheus left the hall, the thunder followed him, distant but attentive. He walked through corridors lined with stories carved in stone, victories, triumphs, the sanitized memory of violence framed as destiny. He wondered how many truths had been smoothed into myth by hands that feared complexity. On a balcony overlooking the mortal world, he stopped. The sun was lower now, its light thinner, stretched across the land like a promise already breaking. Below, smoke rose from a distant wildfire, sparked by lightning, uncontrolled, brief, terrifying. Mortals fled from it as often as they ran toward it, drawn and repelled by the same phenomenon. Zeus saw that chaos and called it justification. Prometheus saw it and called it proof. Fire existed already, wild and merciless. The gods had not eliminated it. They had merely monopolized its discipline. In denying mortals the means to command flame, Olympus condemned them to fear it forever. Prometheus rested his hands on the cold marble and felt the weight of the decision he had not yet made settle into inevitability. The law of fear was simple. Keep others weak, and you remain strong. It was effective. It was stable. It was also brittle. Fear could hold a world in place for a time, but it could not teach it how to grow. Prometheus understood then that his disagreement with Zeus was not about compassion versus cruelty, but about faith. Zeus had faith in control. Prometheus had faith in potential. The two could not coexist indefinitely. Somewhere below, night began to claim the earth again, and with it came the quiet rituals of survival, the small defiant acts of beings who refused to lie down and disappear. Prometheus watched the darkness spread and felt no anger toward Zeus, no hatred for Olympus. What he felt was something colder and more decisive: resolve. The law of fear would endure as long as no one challenged its premise. Fire would challenge it. Knowledge always did. Prometheus turned away from the balcony, the thunder finally breaking behind him, and walked with measured steps toward the place where fire was kept. He did not hurry. He did not hide. Decisions of this magnitude did not require secrecy so much as acceptance. Zeus would call what came next betrayal. Olympus would call it treason. Prometheus had found a different name for it, one that felt truer in the silence of his own mind: responsibility. Fire was not born in Olympus, though Olympus liked to pretend otherwise. The gods spoke of it as if it were an heirloom, a divine artifact passed from hand to hand since the shaping of the world. But Prometheus knew better. Fire did not belong to the sky any more than the river belonged to its banks. It existed because the universe allowed friction, because matter resisted itself, because energy refused to remain still. The gods did not create fire. They curated it. They enclosed it. They disciplined it until it behaved, and then they called that obedience ownership. Prometheus had learned the truth of fire long before the gods learned how to decorate it. He had watched it tear through forests when lightning struck without warning, had seen it devour entire landscapes with a hunger that felt almost sentient, had watched it die just as suddenly, leaving behind only ash and the stunned silence of absence. Fire was chaos, yes, but it was also clarity. Where it passed, nothing was hidden. It reduced the world to essentials, stripped illusion from matter, revealed what could endure heat and what could not. That honesty was what made it dangerous. Olympus preferred mysteries it could control. Fire refused control unless it was understood. In the halls of the gods, fire was tame. It burned without consuming, warmed without threatening, illuminated without revealing too much. It was a performance, a domesticated version of something far more profound. Prometheus had always found those controlled flames unsettling, like animals bred for beauty rather than survival. They did not roar. They did not smoke. They did not struggle. They existed to reassure the gods of their own mastery. Down on Earth, fire was something else entirely, glimpsed only in moments of terror or miracle. A tree struck by lightning, a patch of grass ignited by chance, a sudden warmth in the cold night that vanished as quickly as it appeared. Mortals did not know how to feed it, did not know how to keep it alive, did not know how to command it. Fire appeared to them like a god itself, capricious, destructive, fleeting. Prometheus understood that what mortals feared was not fire, but their inability to negotiate with it. Power without understanding is always terrifying. Understanding without power is cruelty. Fire was the bridge between the two. Prometheus walked the corridors where the sacred flames were kept, his steps measured, his expression unremarkable. No guard challenged him. No god questioned his presence. He had advised too many councils, solved too many problems, predicted too many disasters to be treated as a threat. That was the irony of foresight. Those who possess it are often dismissed until it is too late. As he passed the braziers, he felt the heat on his skin, familiar and intimate, like a language he had learned long ago and never forgotten. Fire spoke in many dialects. There was the language of warmth, the soft persuasion that coaxed cold flesh into comfort. There was the language of transformation, the way raw meat became nourishment, the way clay hardened into permanence, the way darkness retreated into manageable corners. And there was the language of destruction, the honest vocabulary of endings. Fire did not lie about what it did. It did not pretend to be kind when it was cruel, or gentle when it was lethal. That transparency appealed to Prometheus more than any divine decree. He thought of Zeus's words, of the certainty with which the king of gods had dismissed the idea of sharing fire. Zeus feared ambition, feared what mortals might build if given the means. Prometheus did not deny that fear its logic. He simply understood that ambition was already there, smoldering in the human mind, waiting for oxygen. Denying fire did not extinguish ambition. It starved it into uglier forms. Without fire, humans fought with stones. With fire, they would fight with weapons. The difference was not moral. It was technical. And technical differences change outcomes. Prometheus paused before a great hearth where the flame burned steady and bright, fed by no visible fuel. He studied it not as a thief studies a prize, but as a craftsman studies a tool. Fire was not a gift to be handed over carelessly. It required context. It required restraint. It required knowledge. Prometheus knew that the act of giving fire would be incomplete without the act of teaching. Mortals would need more than a spark. They would need the understanding of how to keep it, how to use it without being consumed by it. He had considered this for a long time, turning the problem over in his mind like a stone worn smooth by water. Knowledge could not be controlled once released. That was its nature. But it could be guided at the beginning, shaped by the first hands that held it. Prometheus did not delude himself into believing he could determine how humanity would use fire in the long term. He could only influence the first chapter. That would have to be enough. As he reached out, not yet touching the flame, he reflected on the paradox that defined his existence. He had survived by aligning with power, by understanding how systems endured. Now he was preparing to undermine that system in the most fundamental way possible. The thought did not trouble him as much as it should have. Perhaps that was because the decision had already been made long ago, in fragments, in quiet observations, in sleepless eternities spent watching suffering repeat itself with mechanical precision. This was not a sudden rebellion. It was the culmination of patience. Fire responded to his presence, flickering slightly, as if recognizing a familiar mind. Prometheus smiled, faintly, at the notion. He did not believe fire possessed intention, but he believed the universe responded to those who understood its patterns. He withdrew a hollow reed he had prepared, simple and unremarkable, the kind of object that drew no attention because it did not look important. That too, was a lesson mortals would learn. The most powerful tools are often the ones that look like nothing at all. As the embers settled into the reed, alive but contained, Prometheus felt the weight of what he was carrying settle into his chest. This was not merely heat. This was leverage. This was memory waiting to be written. This was the end of one era and the beginning of another, compressed into a fragile glow. He turned away from the hearth, the flame behind him continuing its obedient burn, unaware that it had just been diminished by the smallest fraction and altered forever by the loss. Olympus did not shudder. The heavens did not cry out. The gods did not notice. That, Prometheus thought, was the most telling detail of all. Systems rarely recognize their own undoing at the moment it begins. As he walked toward the edge of Olympus, the ember hidden, his thoughts did not dwell on punishment or chains or pain. Those were consequences, and consequences were the language of the present. Prometheus was already thinking beyond them, toward the world below, toward hands that would tremble as they held warmth that did not vanish, toward nights that would no longer belong entirely to fear. Fire was not salvation. It was invitation, an invitation to change, to choose, to become more than what the gods had permitted. Prometheus understood then, with a clarity that felt almost peaceful, that the nature of fire was not destruction or creation alone. Its true nature was refusal. Fire refused to remain where it was placed. It refused to be ignored. It refused to be owned. In giving fire to mortals, Prometheus was not stealing from the gods. He was returning the universe to itself. Rebellion did not announce itself with banners or thunder. It rarely did. The universe, Prometheus had learned, was not changed by spectacle, but by quiet violations of expectation, by moments so small they were dismissed until their consequences could no longer be ignored. Carrying the ember within the hollow reed, he moved through Olympus without haste, without secrecy, without fear. He walked as one who belonged, because in that place, belonging was the most effective disguise. The gods were accustomed to watching for force, for defiance that raised its voice and demanded to be crushed. They did not watch for resolve that kept its head bowed and its steps measured. Prometheus passed through archways carved with victories and laws, past statues that immortalized obedience as virtue, past halls where gods debated the distribution of worship as if it were grain. No one stopped him. No one sensed the fracture moving silently through the heart of their dominion. That was the nature of complacency. It dulled perception, mistook continuity for invulnerability. The ember pressed warm against his awareness, a constant reminder that the point of no return had already been crossed. Prometheus did not think of it as theft. Theft implies illegitimacy, and fire had never been legitimate property. He thought of it as correction, a misalignment adjusted, a truth placed where it could do its work. The farther he moved from the hearths of Olympus, the more the air seemed to change, thinning not in substance, but in assumption. Here, the god's certainty was less absolute. Here, the edges of the world grew closer. At the boundary between the divine heights and the mortal expanse below, Prometheus paused. Before him stretched the vast, uneven tapestry of the earth, darkened by the approach of night. Fires sparked by lightning flickered and died in distant places, brief scars of light that could not sustain themselves. He imagined those sparks held instead, nurtured, multiplied. He imagined the dark retreating not all at once, but steadily, reluctantly, as if persuaded rather than defeated. Prometheus did not descend in a blaze of glory. He did not ride the storm or split the sky. He moved downward like an idea, slipping past a guard too tired to question it, carried by currents of air that did not resist him. As Olympus receded above, the world below grew louder, rougher, more honest. The smells of damp earth and living bodies replaced the sterile clarity of divine halls. The sounds of struggle replaced the measured echoes of command. Prometheus welcomed the change. This was the world he had been watching for so long, the world that would bear the consequences of his choice. He found them where he knew he would, a small cluster of mortals, sheltering near the mouth of a cave, their bodies pressed close, their eyes reflecting starlight with the dull sheen of constant vigilance. They stiffened as he approached, instincts honed by generations of vulnerability screaming danger. To them, anything unfamiliar was a threat. Prometheus did not fault them for it. He knelt slowly, deliberately, lowering himself to their level, making himself smaller rather than larger. The ember's light was hidden still, but its warmth radiated subtly, enough to be felt before it was seen. Confusion flickered across their faces, followed by awe, then fear sharpened by hope. Prometheus spoke, but not in the thunderous language of gods. He shaped his voice into something gentler, something closer to the cadence of the earth, and the mortals understood not the words, but the intention behind them. He revealed the flame. The reaction was immediate and profound. Gasps escaped lips that had learned to remain silent. Hands reached out and withdrew, caught between desire and dread. The fire burned steady, obedient within its narrow prison, and for the first time it did not vanish. Prometheus watched as understanding struggled into being, slow and fragile. He did not rush them. He placed the reed carefully on stone, stepped back, allowed choice to do its work. One mortal, a woman with eyes sharpened by loss and patience, extended her hands toward the warmth. When she did not recoil, when the fire did not bite, something broke loose inside the group, a sound halfway between laughter and sobbing. Prometheus felt it then, the subtle shift in the world's balance, like a scale tipped by a feather that happened to be placed at exactly the right point. He stayed long enough to teach, though teaching was perhaps too grand a word. He demonstrated how to feed the flame, how to shelter it from wind and rain, how to understand its moods. He showed them not dominance, but negotiation. Fire responded, growing brighter, stronger, alive in a way it had never been in their presence before. Prometheus did not tell them what to do with it. He did not instruct them in morality or warn them of future horrors. Warnings, he knew, were often mistaken for permission. Instead, he gave them the means and let consequence become its own lesson. When he left, the fire remained, a steady pulse of light in a world that had never known such constancy. Prometheus ascended again, not to Olympus immediately, but to the high places where wind scoured thought clean. Below him, the flame multiplied, carried from hand to hand, from place to place, spreading not as an explosion, but as a whisper. Night fell, and for the first time, it did not fully claim the earth. Olympus felt it before it saw it. A disturbance, faint but unmistakable, rippled through the divine senses like an itch beneath armor. Zeus rose from his throne as the realization formed, slow and incredulous. Fire burned below, not wild and accidental, but tended, controlled, shared. The law of fear cracked, just slightly, and through that crack poured possibility. Rage followed, swift and righteous, but beneath it lay something colder, recognition. Zeus knew what this meant. Prometheus knew he would know. When the king of gods called him forth, the summons carried no surprise. Prometheus answered without delay. He stood before Zeus as he always had, unbowed, unarmed, unchanged in posture, if not in destiny. Thunder gathered, the sky itself leaning toward judgment. "You have taken what was forbidden," Zeus said, and the words were not accusation so much as confirmation. Prometheus did not deny it. "I have returned what was withheld," he replied. The gods gathered, their expressions ranging from fury to fascination to silent calculation. Zeus looked at Prometheus as one might look at a fault line newly exposed. "You have armed them," Zeus said. "You have invited chaos." Prometheus met his gaze steadily. "I have given them choice," he said. Chaos was already there. Silence stretched, taut and dangerous. Zeus's voice, when it came, was low. "You knew the cost." "Yes," Prometheus said, "and I paid it willingly." Zeus studied him for a long moment, and in that moment, something like regret flickered and vanished. "Then you will be made an example," Zeus said, "not because you failed, but because you succeeded." Prometheus accepted the sentence before it was spoken. He felt no triumph, no sorrow, only a deep, settled certainty. The silent rebellion was complete. Fire burned. The world had changed. Whatever followed would not undo that fact. Prometheus stood as the chains began to form, already knowing that the pain to come would be vast and unending, and also knowing that somewhere below, in the dark made smaller by human hands, a flame endured. The first night after fire did not belong to the gods. It belonged to hands that trembled as they learned the weight of warmth, to eyes that widened at shadows retreating instead of advancing, to breaths drawn deeper than fear had ever allowed before. Across the earth, small circles of light appeared like hesitant thoughts forming in the dark, fragile at first, uncertain, but stubborn in their refusal to vanish. Mortals gathered around the flames as if around a living thing, careful, reverent, astonished that the world could be persuaded rather than endured. Fire changed the night immediately, not by banishing it entirely, but by giving it edges. Darkness was no longer an absolute. It was something that could be held back, negotiated with, named. Children slept longer, their dreams less fractured by cold. Elders spoke without rushing, their voices no longer chased by the fear of freezing silence. Food cooked instead of rotted, and its smell carried through the air like a promise the world had finally decided to keep. Fire revealed itself as teacher as much as tool. Mortals learned quickly what burned and what endured, what fed the flame and what smothered it. They learned patience, learned restraint, learned that power demanded attention. Fire punished carelessness without malice and rewarded understanding without favoritism. In this, it differed profoundly from the gods. Where Olympus ruled by decree, fire ruled by consequence. Prometheus watched from above as the change rippled outward, subtle but relentless. The mortals did not become gods. They did not stand taller or stronger overnight. What changed was posture. Backs straightened, movements slowed, eyes lifted from the ground more often. Fear did not disappear, but it loosened its grip, no longer the sole architect of choice. In that loosening, something new took root: deliberation. Mortals began to plan beyond the next sunrise. They spoke of tomorrow not as a threat, but as a possibility. Some prayed less, some prayed differently. The gods felt it like a draft in a sealed hall. Worship did not cease, but it shifted. Gratitude replaced desperation. Praise became conditional. This unsettled Olympus more than rebellion ever could. Ares scoffed at the change, calling it temporary, a novelty that would burn itself out. Athena watched with narrowed eyes, already cataloging strategies born beside hearths. Apollo sensed songs forming that did not require his name. Hera felt the subtle insult of mortals, gathering strength without permission. Zeus felt it all, and what he felt most keenly was not rage, but erosion. Authority, once absolute, was learning the shape of resistance. Below, fire spread not as conquest, but as inheritance. One tribe carried embers to another. One flame became many without diminishing itself. The mortals did not hoard it. They shared, instinctively understanding that some powers grow stronger when divided. Prometheus saw this and felt a quiet affirmation settle into his bones. The choice he had made was not redeeming humanity. It was trusting it. Trust, he knew, was the most radical act of all. Yet even as warmth bloomed across the earth, the shadow of consequence lengthened. Fire sharpened not only tools but desires. With light came ambition. With cooked meat came surplus. With surplus came comparison. Some mortals looked at the flame and saw not comfort, but leverage. They began to imagine dominance not just over nature, but over each other. Prometheus saw this too. He did not turn away. He had never believed in perfect outcomes. He believed in honest ones. The gods pointed to these first flickers of violence as proof of their righteousness. Zeus spoke of it in council, his voice calm, vindicated. "Already they burn each other," he said. "Already they misuse what they do not understand," Prometheus answered. "They misuse it because they are learning. The gods misuse power after eternities." That answer sealed nothing and resolved nothing. Zeus had already moved beyond debate. The punishment was underway. Chains were forged not in haste, but with care, each link and articulation of authority. The mountain chosen was not random. It stood at the edge of the world, where sky met stone, where isolation was complete. Prometheus was taken there not as spectacle, but as message. The gods did not need an audience. They needed a symbol. As he was bound, Prometheus felt the weight of eternity settle into place. Pain followed, sharp and intimate, but it did not surprise him. He catalogued it as he catalogued all things, noting its rhythm, its limits, its failure to consume meaning. When the eagle came for the first time, tearing into flesh that would not die, Prometheus closed his eyes and thought not of Olympus, not of Zeus, but of fire held steady in human hands. Below him, seasons turned, indifferent to divine drama. Mortals adapted. They learned to store warmth against winter, to cook clay into vessels that preserved memory, to shape metal that held edge and intention. Fire became center rather than miracle. Around it, stories formed. Not stories of gods alone, but stories of people. Of hunts survived, of nights endured, of choices made. Prometheus listened to those stories as they reached him in fragments, carried by wind and time. He listened and endured. Olympus expected him to break, to beg, to recant. He did none of these things. Each dawn, as the eagle returned, Prometheus reminded himself of a truth Zeus could never accept. Punishment does not erase consequence. The fire burned regardless of his suffering. Knowledge, once given, did not return to the giver when he was destroyed. It lived elsewhere now, in minds that could not be chained. The gods watched the world change and told themselves it was manageable. They always did. Systems built on control believe themselves eternal until the moment they are not. Prometheus understood that he might never see the end of this transformation. Immortality did not guarantee freedom, but it did grant perspective. He saw that the mortal's relationship with the gods was shifting from terror to tension, from obedience to negotiation. Prayers became requests rather than pleas. Offerings became transactions rather than tributes. This angered Zeus more than any insult could have. Power tolerated reverence. It despised parody. Bound to the mountain, Prometheus smiled faintly at that thought, even as pain lanced through him once more. The smile was not defiance. It was recognition. When mortals touched light, they touched something else as well. Agency. And agency, once awakened, does not sleep again. The gods could punish a titan. They could not unteach a species. As night fell again across the world, the fires below did not go out. They burned steadily, stubbornly, illuminating faces that now looked outward instead of downward. Prometheus endured the darkness above them, knowing that while his body was bound to stone, his choice had already escaped him, spreading, multiplying, refusing to be contained. Judgment in Olympus was not a trial. It was a confirmation. The verdict always existed before the gathering began, etched into the architecture of power like a watermark only authority could see. The gods assembled not to decide Prometheus's fate, but to witness it, to participate in the ritual by which inevitability dressed itself as law. The air in the high hall thickened as if the mountain itself leaned inward, eager to listen. and thunder waited at the edges of silence, like a blade kept sharp through neglect. Zeus presided without ceremony, his presence enough to anchor the room into obedience, and when Prometheus was brought before him, chains humming softly with divine intent, the contrast between them was not of size or strength, but of posture. Zeus rooted, immovable, Prometheus upright, unyielding. The gathered gods studied him as one studies a fracture in marble, calculating whether it could spread. Athena's eyes traced the logic of his actions with uncomfortable admiration. Apollo watched with a distant melancholy, as if already composing a song he would never sing aloud. Ares radiated impatience, eager for spectacle. Hera weighed the insult not against Prometheus, but against the order she guarded with ruthless fidelity. None spoke at first. Silence in Olympus was the prelude to dominance. Zeus broke it with a voice measured enough to sound fair. He named the transgression plainly, without embellishment, without anger, as if cataloging a natural disaster. Fire had been taken. Fire had been given. The law had been broken. Prometheus listened without interruption, not because he feared the king of gods, but because interruption implies a belief that one can change the outcome. He had moved beyond that belief. When Zeus finished, he asked a question that was not a question at all. Did Prometheus deny the charge? Prometheus answered with the truth, because lies were a currency Olympus had already devalued beyond usefulness. He did not deny it. He did not justify it in the language of mercy or love. He spoke instead of responsibility, of proportion between power and obligation, of the difference between rule and stewardship. The words fell into the hall like sparks onto damp stone, hissing, failing to catch, but altering the air nonetheless. Zeus listened with the patience of one indulging an argument he had already dismantled. He replied not by refuting Prometheus's reasoning, but by reframing it, by asserting that responsibility belonged to those who could enforce consequences. That order was not a moral preference, but a survival mechanism, that the universe had already suffered enough under the whims of idealists. He spoke of the Titans without naming them, of chaos tamed by decisive force, of a cosmos that demanded hierarchy the way bodies demanded bones. Prometheus did not contest the history. He contested the interpretation. He reminded the court that stability purchased through fear accrues interest, that the cost compounds quietly until collapse becomes the only form of payment left. Athena shifted at that, the strategist recognizing an uncomfortable truth she could not publicly acknowledge. Zeus's gaze sharpened. He asked whether Prometheus believed himself wiser than the gods. Prometheus answered that wisdom was not a crown but a burden, that it required acting when inaction preserved comfort at the expense of justice. The word justice rippled through the hall, dangerous in its ambiguity. Hera's expression hardened. Zeus rose. The movement was slow, deliberate, the kind that recalibrates a room. He spoke of precedent, of the necessity of deterrence, of the message that must be sent to mortals and gods alike when divine law was breached. He framed the punishment as mercy, as containment rather than annihilation, as an example that preserved the offender, even as it erased the offense. Prometheus recognized the elegance of the cruelty. Death would have ended the matter. Eternal suffering would keep it alive. Zeus asked the council for assent, not because he required it, but because shared responsibility diluted future regret. One by one, the gods signaled agreement, some with conviction, some with reluctance, some with relief that the decision was not theirs alone. No one dissented. Silence, once again, did the work of unanimity. When Zeus pronounced the sentence, he did so without flourish. Prometheus would be bound to the mountain at the edge of the world. An eagle would come each day to consume what immortality would restore by night. The punishment would have no end, not because vengeance required perpetuity, but because memory did. Olympus needed a living reminder. Prometheus accepted the decree as one accepts gravity. He did not plead. He did not rage. He asked only one question, quiet enough to be mistaken for curiosity. Would the fire be taken back? Zeus did not answer immediately. When he did, his voice carried something like irritation. The fire could not be recalled without further destabilizing the world, he said. It would be managed, contained, regulated. Prometheus nodded, satisfied not with the assurance, but with the admission beneath it. Even Zeus understood that some actions could not be undone without admitting weakness. As Prometheus was led away, chains tightening with each step, the gods resumed their postures, the hall relaxing back into routine. Olympus had passed judgment. Order had been reaffirmed. And yet, as the thunder rolled to mark the end of the assembly, something subtle had shifted. The law had been enforced, but the premise beneath it had been exposed. Mortals had touched light, and the gods had responded not by guiding that change, but by punishing its source. The distinction would not go unnoticed forever. Prometheus felt the mountains cold long before he reached it, felt the isolation settle into his bones like a second skeleton. He did not mistake endurance for victory, but he recognized the asymmetry of the exchange. Zeus had won the moment. Prometheus had altered the trajectory. Judgment could bind a body. It could not bind an idea already in motion. As the chains anchored him to stone and the sky darkened with approaching ritual, Prometheus fixed his gaze not on Olympus, but on the distant glow scattered across the earth, small and numerous and stubborn. The court had spoken. The sentence had been passed. And somewhere below, a child fed a fire and learned for the first time that night was not invincible. The mountain did not welcome him. Stone rarely does. It rose from the edge of the world like a verdict given form, raw and unfinished, its face scarred by winds that had never learned how to rest. Here, the sky felt closer, heavier, pressing downward as if even the heavens wished to witness what would be done. Prometheus was bound not at the summit, where gods might be tempted to look upon him with something like reverence, but along a sheer wall of rock where nothing grew and nothing lingered. Isolation was part of the design. Memory required distance to sharpen its lesson. The chains bit into him with a precision that felt almost respectful, forged not merely to restrain flesh, but to articulate authority. Each link carried intention, the distilled will of Olympus made tangible, humming faintly as if reminding him that power, when threatened, becomes meticulous. When the last chain locked into place, the mountain seemed to exhale, a low, grinding sound that traveled through stone and bone alike. Prometheus tested the bonds once, not in hope of escape, but in acknowledgement. They held. Of course they did. Zeus did not build failures. The cold came quickly. Olympus's punishments were efficient. Wind scoured his skin, stripping warmth without malice, and impersonal force doing what it had always done. Prometheus welcomed it. Cold was honest. It did not pretend to teach lessons. It simply existed. Pain followed, settling into him like a resident rather than a visitor. He cataloged it as he always had, noting its patterns, its insistence, its refusal to escalate into madness. Immortality was not invulnerability. It was endurance without release. That was the true cruelty of the sentence. A mortal would have broken quickly. Prometheus would not break at all. Time passed differently on the mountain. Days were measured not by the sun's arc, but by anticipation. The air itself seemed to pause before dawn, holding its breath as if aware of what was to come. When the eagle arrived for the first time, its wings cut the sky with a sound like tearing cloth. It did not hesitate. Hesitation would have implied doubt, and the creature had been shaped for certainty. Its talons found flesh with brutal efficiency, and pain erupted not as surprise, but as confirmation. Prometheus did not scream. He had never believed screams changed outcomes. He focused instead on sensation, on the precision with which suffering was administered, on the strange neutrality of the act. The eagle was not cruel. It was obedient. Olympus preferred instruments that did not question. When the bird retreated and dusk closed in, Prometheus felt his body knit itself back together, the wound sealing with a completeness that felt obscene. Regeneration was not relief. It was preparation. Night brought no mercy, only the promise of repetition. And yet, as the hours stretched, Prometheus found that his thoughts did not fracture under the weight of pain. They sharpened. The mountain, stripped of distraction, became a lens. Bound to stone, he saw more clearly than he ever had in the comfort of marble halls. He thought of the mortals below, of their fires burning low but steady, of the way they would learn to tend embers through the long dark. He imagined their mistakes, their burns, their small triumphs. He imagined them telling stories about the first flame, embellishing, mythologizing, forgetting the details while preserving the meaning. He did not mind being forgotten as a person. He cared only that the act endured. Olympus expected despair. Despair, after all, was the logical response to infinite punishment. Prometheus disappointed them again. He felt sorrow. Yes, a quiet grief for the simplicity of what might have been. But despair requires belief in futility, and Prometheus had already seen the future bending. The mountain could claim his body. It could not claim the consequence of his choice. Each dawn, as pain returned with mechanical certainty, he reminded himself of that distinction. Zeus believed punishment deterred action. Prometheus believed it clarified values. The mountain began to scream over time, not with sound, but with presence. Winds howled against its face, storms battered it without pause, and still it stood, eroding grain by grain, resisting collapse not through strength, but through persistence. Prometheus recognized something familiar in that. Endurance was not glamorous. It did not look like victory. It looked like refusal to disappear. He became part of the mountain's rhythm, a fixed point around which weather and cruelty revolved. The gods visited rarely. When they did, they came not to comfort or condemn, but to observe, to reassure themselves that the system still functioned. Prometheus met their gazes without resentment. Resentment wasted energy. Understanding conserved it. He understood that Zeus did not hate him. Hatred implies intimacy. Zeus feared precedent. He feared the idea that divine law could be challenged not by force, but by principle. That fear would outlive any punishment. As seasons blurred into one another, Prometheus noticed something else. The mountain listened. Stone does not think, but it remembers. It absorbed his endurance, his silence, his refusal to beg, and in doing so, it became a witness. Olympus had intended the mountain as an instrument of erasure. Instead, it became an archive. Long after gods forgot the details of the sentence, the mountain would remain, scarred by chains, echoing with a story that could not be fully suppressed. Prometheus took comfort in that unintended outcome. The universe, he knew, had a habit of subverting intentions. When the eagle came again, and again, and again, Prometheus endured not by numbing himself, but by anchoring his mind to meaning. Pain was transient, even when repeated. Consequence was permanent. Fire burned. Mortals learned. Olympus adjusted, reluctantly, uneasily. Bound to the screaming mountain, Prometheus became what Zeus had feared without fully understanding. Not a rebel in chains, but a constant reminder that authority, once questioned, is never whole again. The eagle was not born cruel. Cruelty requires intention, and the creature that descended upon the mountain each dawn possessed none beyond obedience. It was shaped by command, hollowed of hesitation. Its instincts sharpened into a single relentless purpose. When its shadow crossed the stone, the air itself seemed to recoil, and Prometheus felt the familiar tightening in the hours before sunrise. Not fear, but recognition. Anticipation is a form of knowledge, and knowledge, once acquired, rarely leaves quietly. The eagle arrived with the precision of a ritual, perfected through repetition. Wings slicing the sky, talons extended, eyes fixed not on Prometheus as a being, but on the task inscribed into its existence. Pain followed, immediate and intimate, a sensation so complete it erased the illusion of separation between body and suffering. Prometheus did not resist. Resistance would have implied the hope of change within the act itself, and he had learned that hope misplaced is merely another form of cruelty. Instead, he observed. He noted the way the eagle's beak found the same place again and again, the way flesh yielded and reformed, the way immortality turned violation into routine. The gods had designed the punishment carefully. Variety might have numbed the mind. Consistency sharpened it. Each dawn, the same wound. Each dusk, the same restoration. Eternity reduced to a loop. And yet, within that loop, Prometheus discovered something Olympus had not anticipated. Repetition does not erase meaning. It distills it. The eagle did not hate him. In that absence of hatred lay a strange clarity. The suffering inflicted upon him was not personal. It was procedural. Zeus had not chosen an enemy. He had enforced a system. Prometheus understood then that the true conflict had never been between two wills, but between two philosophies of order. One believed stability was preserved through fear and example. The other believed progress was born through risk and trust. The eagle was merely the instrument through which that disagreement was made flesh. Sometimes, as the bird tore away what would be restored by nightfall, Prometheus wondered if the gods understood the irony of their creation. The eagle was relentless, tireless, unquestioning the ideal servant. And yet, it embodied the very flaw Zeus feared in mortals, the capacity to cause harm without reflection. Olympus condemned Prometheus for giving fire to beings who might misuse it, then employed a creature that misused violence with perfect consistency. The contradiction did not anger Prometheus. It confirmed him. Pain narrowed the world until only essentials remained. In those moments, stripped of comfort and distraction, Prometheus found his thoughts wandering not upward toward Olympus, but outward, following the spread of fire across the earth. He imagined the way mortals learned to shape metal, the way sparks danced under hammer blows, the way weapons and tools shared the same ancestry. Fire was impartial. It offered possibility without guidance. Choice supplied the rest. Prometheus did not pretend this absolved him of responsibility. He carried that weight willingly. He had known what fire would unleash. He had accepted that knowledge as the price of action. What surprised him was not the existence of violence, but the emergence of restraint alongside it. Mortals learned, slowly, painfully, that unchecked flame consumed as readily as it sustained. Villages burned, hands scarred, lives were lost. And from those losses, knowledge accumulated. Fire taught consequences more honestly than Olympus ever had. The eagle's visits became markers of time, more reliable than seasons. Between them, Prometheus learned to inhabit stillness. He listened to the wind carve stories into stone. He watched clouds gather and disperse, indifferent to his suffering, and found comfort in that indifference. The universe did not revolve around punishment. It simply continued. That continuity was a form of mercy. Occasionally, other gods came to observe. Hermes lingered once, eyes troubled, saying nothing. Athena stood at a distance, studying not the chains, but Prometheus's expression, as if searching for signs of regret. She did not find them. Regret implies an alternate path that would have been better. Prometheus saw only different costs, not different truths. Ares laughed once, mocking endurance he could not understand, and left bored when there was no spectacle to feed on. Zeus never came. He did not need to. Power rarely revisits decisions it considers settled. Bound to the mountain, Prometheus began to understand the eagle not as an enemy, but as a mirror. The bird reflected the god's belief that control could be automated, that authority could be enforced without ongoing moral engagement. Once the system was built, it would run itself. Punishment would perpetuate obedience. The eagle's existence was proof of that belief. And yet, each day it came, and each day it left, and each night the wound closed, and each dawn it reopened, and the world below continued to change regardless. The system functioned. The outcome did not align with its intention. That, Prometheus thought, was the fatal flaw of systems built on fear. They assume stasis. They do not account for adaptation. As centuries accumulated like sediment, Prometheus noticed something subtle. The pain no longer defined him. It remained vivid, unavoidable, but it ceased to be central. Meaning migrated elsewhere. He became, in his own mind, less a victim than a witness. The eagle could take flesh. It could not take perspective. Perspective, once achieved, is difficult to unlearn. In rare moments of quiet, Prometheus imagined what the gods might think when they realized that his punishment had failed to produce repentance. He did not fantasize about the regret. Regret was not required. Awareness would suffice. The eagle would continue its work. The chains would hold. Olympus would maintain its posture of control. And still, mortals would build, burn, create, destroy, and learn. Fire would move through history like a question no one could fully answer, reshaping the world with every attempt. When the eagle returned at dawn, as it always did, Prometheus met it with the same steady gaze. He did not curse it. He did not plead with it. He endured it. Endurance, he had learned, was not passive. It was active resistance against erasure. Each day he remained unbroken. The punishment lost a fraction of its intended power. Zeus had wanted a warning. What he had created was a constant, a reminder, not of divine authority, but of its limits. As dusk fell and the wound closed once more, Prometheus felt the familiar exhaustion settle into him, deep and bone-heavy. He welcomed it. Exhaustion was proof of survival. Somewhere far below, a forge glowed, sparks rising into the night, and a human hand shaped metal with deliberate care. Prometheus could not see it. He did not need to. The eagle slept, the mountain held, the fire burned. And in that unbroken sequence, Prometheus understood that punishment could be infinite and still insufficient to undo a single well-chosen act. Time did not soften the mountain. It did not soften Prometheus either. What it did was remove illusion, layer by layer, until only what could not be worn away remained. Mortals spoke of time as healer because their wounds were brief enough to forget, because memory blurred as bodies failed. Immortals were denied that mercy. For Prometheus, time was not a balm, but a solvent, dissolving distractions, exposing the skeleton of belief beneath habit and pain. Days folded into years, years into centuries, until duration itself lost texture and became something like weather, omnipresent and indifferent. The rhythm of suffering continued, precise as ever, but it no longer dominated his inner landscape. Pain was constant, yes, but constancy dulls novelty, and novelty is what suffering feeds on. What remained sharp was awareness. Prometheus learned the weight of stillness, the kind that presses inward rather than outward, forcing thought to deepen or fracture. He chose depth. In the long hours between dawn and dusk, he revisited the moments that had led him here, not with regret, but with analysis. He examined his own certainty, the way a craftsman examines a blade, checking for flaws, testing balance. Had he been arrogant? Perhaps. Arrogance and conviction often share a silhouette. Had he underestimated the cost? No. He had known the price. What surprised him was not the punishment, but the god's inability to move beyond it. Olympus had frozen the moment of rebellion into an eternal display, assuming that repetition would override meaning. They had misunderstood time. Time does not erase meaning for those who remember why they chose it. It clarifies it. Prometheus felt that clarification settle into him like a second consciousness, calm and immovable. He thought often of the mortal's relationship with time, of how fire had altered it. Before, they lived moment to moment, chased by cold and hunger, their futures short enough to feel imaginary. Now, with warmth and light, time stretched. Planning became possible. Memory gained value. Mortals began to mark seasons deliberately, to count days not merely survived, but anticipated. Fire did not just warm bodies. It expanded horizons. Prometheus traced those changes like a map unfolding slowly in his mind. He imagined villages becoming settlements, settlements becoming cities, cities becoming engines of both creation and destruction. He imagined laws written beside hearths, stories refined by generations, tools evolving into machines whose heat would rival the sun. He saw horrors too, wars amplified by technology, flames consuming forests, not by accident, but by design. He did not look away from those visions. To look away would have been another form of cowardice. Knowledge, he believed, did not become less true because it was uncomfortable. Time also stripped away his remaining attachments to Olympus. The mountain became his world, its contours familiar, its moods legible. He learned the language of wind and stone, the subtle differences between storms that threatened and storms that merely passed through. He learned to measure the passage of eras by changes in the sky, by the way constellations shifted almost imperceptibly, by the faint evolution of the stars themselves. Olympus, once central, receded into abstraction, a distant structure of power whose concerns felt increasingly narrow. The gods remained immortal, but they were static, orbiting the same fears, repeating the same justifications. Prometheus began to understand that immortality without growth is not eternity. It is stagnation extended indefinitely. Zeus had believed that unchanging rule was the highest form of order. Prometheus saw now that it was simply fear of irrelevance dressed as permanence. Occasionally, whispers reached him, carried by winds that had brushed against the mortal world. Names changed. Languages shifted. The sound of prayer altered its tone. Mortals no longer begged the gods to spare them the night. They asked instead for guidance, for favor, for victory. Some asked for nothing at all. That silence, Prometheus suspected, frightened Olympus more than any blasphemy. Silence implies self-sufficiency. Self-sufficiency erodes the necessity of divine intermediaries. Time magnified that erosion. The gods remained powerful, but power unused atrophies, and power used only to punish invites scrutiny. Prometheus did not rejoice in this. He did not need the gods to fall in order to be vindicated. Vindication was irrelevant. What mattered was trajectory. The world was moving, and Olympus was reacting rather than guiding. That inversion was irreversible. Bound to the mountain, Prometheus also confronted the nature of his own endurance. He discovered that resilience was not infinite, but adaptive. There were days when the pain cut deeper, when memory felt heavy, when the future seemed distant and abstract. On those days, he anchored himself not to grand visions, but to specifics. The imagined sound of fire crackling in a hearth, the smell of cooked grain, the quiet satisfaction of a tool shaped to fit a human hand. Small images, grounded and real. Meaning, he learned, does not require grandeur to survive. It requires continuity. Time did not heal him. It refined him. It stripped away any lingering desire to be understood by the gods, leaving behind a simpler, sturdier resolve. The acceptance that some acts are done not to be praised or forgiven, but because they align with what one believes the universe should permit. Prometheus began to see himself less as a rebel and more as a hinge, a point of transition between ages. The pain would continue. The chains would not loosen. Zeus would not reconsider. None of that altered the fact that the world below was no longer what it had been. Time, indifferent and unstoppable, would ensure that. As dusk fell once more, and the mountain settled into its familiar quiet, Prometheus closed his eyes and let the rhythm of existence carry him forward. He did not wait for rescue. He did not hope for release. He endured, not as an act of defiance, but as a form of participation in a longer story. Time does not heal immortals. It reveals what they truly are willing to live with. The gods did not abandon Prometheus entirely. They simply learned how to look without seeing, how to pass by suffering without engaging it, how to turn endurance into background. That, Prometheus came to understand, was a more sophisticated cruelty than neglect. Olympus had perfected distance. When the gods visited the mountain, they did so with the careful detachment of scholars, examining a specimen, never close enough to be implicated, never long enough to be changed. Hermes came first, more often than the others, drawn by motion and messages, lingering at the edge of conversation without stepping fully into it. He spoke lightly, as if levity could bridge the gulf between them, as if words might soften stone. He asked questions that skirted meaning and offered updates stripped of consequence. Which cities prospered, which kings fell, which prayers rose loudest that season. Prometheus listened without judgment, grateful not for the content, but for the acknowledgement that the world continued. Hermes never mentioned the chains. He never mentioned the eagle. He left quickly, as if staying too long might require him to choose a side. Athena came less frequently, but with more intent. She did not speak at first, her gaze tracing the patterns of erosion on the rock, the precise angles at which chains met stone, the way Prometheus held himself even in pain. She watched as if the mountain were a problem to be solved, as if endurance itself were a strategy. When she did speak, it was to ask whether he would make the same choice again. Prometheus answered without hesitation that he would. Athena nodded once, as if confirming a calculation she had already completed, and departed without offering comfort or condemnation. Her silence was heavier than any reproach. Apollo came once, drawn perhaps by the aesthetic of suffering, by the tragic symmetry of a Titan bound against an infinite sky. He sang softly, a melody that hovered between beauty and sorrow, and for a moment the pain receded into something almost bearable. When the song ended, Apollo looked unsettled, as if he had brushed against a truth he could not transform into art without diminishing it. He did not return. Ares arrived in bursts, loud and impatient, scoffing at endurance, mocking the absence of struggle. He wanted violence that answered violence, a conflict that validated itself through spectacle. Prometheus offered him none of that. Without resistance, Ares grew bored, his interest dissolving as quickly as it had flared. Hera never came. Her absence was deliberate, a refusal to dignify disobedience with attention. Prometheus understood her position. Order requires boundaries, and boundaries require examples. Mercy would have blurred the lesson. Zeus remained conspicuously absent. He did not need to witness what he had decreed. Power, when confident, delegates observation. Yet Prometheus felt Zeus's presence regardless, in the way storms gathered with particular intensity, in the way thunder lingered a fraction longer after lightning struck. Zeus watched from afar, measuring effect rather than emotion. He wanted to know whether the punishment worked. He wanted to see if the fire dimmed, if mortals faltered, if fear reclaimed its throne. The answer disappointed him. Mortals adapted. They always did. They learned to build fires that survived rain, to carry embers across distances, to coax warmth from materials that once resisted them. They learned to look at the night not as an enemy, but as a condition that could be modified. Worship changed accordingly. Gods who answered prayers were praised. Gods who did not were questioned. Some were ignored. Olympus felt the shift as a thinning, subtle but cumulative, like a mountain losing a fraction of its mass each year to wind. The gods who looked away told themselves this was temporary, that mortals would overreach, that fire would betray them, that fear would return. Prometheus knew better. Fear, once displaced, does not resume its former authority easily. It returns altered, negotiated, challenged. That was the true gift of fire, not courage, but leverage. Bound to the mountain, Prometheus learned to read the gods' avoidance as data. Looking away was not indifference. It was discomfort. Discomfort signaled awareness. Awareness signaled vulnerability. Olympus was not prepared to examine its own assumptions, and so it avoided the mirror Prometheus had become. Each visit, each silence, each deflection reinforced the same conclusion. The gods did not fear rebellion as much as they feared irrelevance. They feared a world that could proceed without constant divine intervention, a world in which their roles shifted from rulers to participants. That fear explained more than anger ever could. As centuries passed, Prometheus noticed the visits grew rarer. The mountain became quieter, the sky less crowded with divine curiosity. Olympus had turned its attention elsewhere, to new concerns, new distractions, new crises that demanded authority. Prometheus remained, constant and inconvenient, a reminder best left unacknowledged. He did not resent this. Resentment implies expectation, and Prometheus no longer expected understanding from the gods. He had outgrown that need. What he had not outgrown was concern for the trajectory he had set in motion. He continued to listen for the world below, for the faint signals carried upward through wind and time. He sensed when fire became industry, when warmth became weaponry, when knowledge accelerated faster than wisdom. He did not intervene. Intervention was no longer his role. His act had been singular, not ongoing. To interfere again would have been to replace one form of control with another. Prometheus had not given fire to become humanity's steward. He had given it to grant autonomy. That autonomy frightened Olympus more with each passing era. The gods who looked away did so not because Prometheus was broken, but because he was intact. His endurance invalidated their narrative. He had not begged. He had not repented. He had not recanted the principle that power implies responsibility. That principle lingered, unaddressed, unresolved, and thus dangerous. Bound to stone, Prometheus understood that the most subversive position is not opposition, but persistence. He remained where he was, unchanged in posture, if not in understanding, while the gods circled their own anxieties and the world below advanced into complexity. The mountain held. The eagle returned. The gods looked away, and in that triad of endurance, avoidance, and repetition, Prometheus saw the shape of a truth Olympus could not bear to confront. Authority that refuses to engage with consequence eventually forfeits the right to define it. The future did not arrive as revelation. It arrived as accumulation. Bound to the mountain, Prometheus did not see visions the way prophets claimed to, in sudden floods of certainty or divine announcement. He saw patterns. He had always seen patterns. Time, stretched thin across centuries, made them visible in the same way erosion reveals the bones of stone. The future was not a single path, but a braided river, and Prometheus watched its currents converge and separate with a clarity sharpened by stillness. He had known, even before he took the fire, that humanity would not become gentle simply because it became capable. Capability is not morality. It is amplification. Fire would magnify what already existed. Compassion would grow louder. Cruelty would grow sharper. The future he saw held both in uneasy balance, and it was that balance, rather than any imagined perfection, that convinced him he had chosen correctly. From the mountain, he sensed the rise of cities like heat, shimmering above distant plains, dense clusters of ambition and memory, bound together by stone and flame. He sensed laws written to tame violence and institutions built to preserve power. He sensed wars fought not for survival alone, but for identity, for ideology, for visions of order that mirrored Olympus more than Zeus would ever admit. He sensed art too, uncontainable and persistent, looming wherever humans gathered long enough to breathe between conflicts. Songs carried the rhythm of fire, stories shaped by light and shadow, philosophies forged in the glow of hearths where questions were allowed to linger. Prometheus saw tools become machines, machines become systems, systems become abstractions so vast that no single human could fully comprehend them. Fire transformed into energy, energy into networks, networks into forces that rivaled storms. He saw forests fall and oceans darken, not because humanity lacked knowledge, but because it learned faster than it learned restraint. This did not surprise him. Speed has always outpaced wisdom. He saw fear return in new forms, subtler than cold and hunger, more persuasive than darkness. Fear of loss, fear of insignificance, fear of each other. And yet, alongside that fear, he saw resistance take root again and again, renewed by the same force that had first defied the night. Humans learned to question authority, to challenge decrees, to dismantle structures that no longer served them. They did not always succeed. Often they failed catastrophically. But failure, Prometheus knew, was not proof of error. It was proof of attempt. Olympus had once failed catastrophically too. The difference was that Olympus pretended its failures were destiny. Prometheus watched humans invent gods, abandon them, reinvent them in new forms. He watched belief migrate from sky to crown, to coin to idea. He watched devotion attach itself to progress, to nations, to abstractions powerful enough to demand sacrifice. He recognized the familiar architecture of worship reshaping itself, adapting to new materials. Power always seeks reverence. The future held atrocities that made the eagle's daily violence seem almost intimate by comparison. Prometheus did not flinch from that knowledge. He also saw hands reaching across divides, strangers choosing mercy without command, lives risked not for glory, but for principle. He saw individuals stand before systems and say no, often crushed, sometimes heard, always remembered in fragments that inspired others to stand later. That lineage mattered more than outcomes. Zeus had feared that fire would give mortals the means to challenge the gods. He had been right, but incomplete. Fire gave mortals the means to challenge everything, including themselves. That self-reflection, painful and inconsistent, was the axis on which the future turned. Bound to stone, Prometheus felt neither pride nor despair at what he foresaw. Pride implies ownership. Despair implies regret. He claimed neither. He had not acted to control the future, only to make it possible. The mountain taught him patience as vision refined itself. He learned to distinguish inevitability from probability, to accept that even foresight has limits. Some outcomes could be anticipated. Others emerged only through collision, through chance layered upon choice. That uncertainty did not invalidate his decision. It justified it. A future that can be known completely is a future already dead. Occasionally, whispers of prophecy reached the mountain, distorted by time and retelling. Mortals spoke of Prometheus as savior or traitor, martyr or fool. They argued about his intent, his virtue, his arrogance. Prometheus found these debates strangely comforting. Disagreement was a sign of vitality. Olympus had long ago mistaken unanimity for harmony. He preferred discord to silence. As centuries bled into millennia, Prometheus noticed something else. The gods' influence waned not because humans rejected them outright, but because humans absorbed their functions. Law replaced decree. Science replaced miracle. Institutions replaced myth. The gods did not vanish. They diminished, receding into symbol and story. Zeus remained powerful, but power exercised only to punish grows brittle. The future Prometheus saw did not require the fall of Olympus. It required its irrelevance. That, he understood, was the fate Zeus had been fighting all along. Bound to the mountain, Prometheus accepted his role as witness to that slow transformation. He would not guide it. He would not correct it. The act that mattered had already been completed. Everything else belonged to those who lived and died within time, who bore the cost of choice without the buffer of immortality. When the eagle came again, tearing into flesh that would renew by nightfall, Prometheus closed his eyes and let the pain pass through him without resistance. Pain was immediate. The future was vast. Between the two, he chose to anchor himself to the latter. The future he had already seen was not kind. It was not just. It was not safe. It was alive. And life, he believed, was worth the risk of being burned. The question did not come immediately. Questions of that weight rarely do. They wait until pain has become familiar, until endurance has proven itself unremarkable, until even the gods grow tired of certainty. When Zeus finally came to the mountain, the sky announced him not with spectacle, but with pressure, the air thickening as if the world itself were bracing. Prometheus sensed him before he appeared, a shift in the rhythm of storms, a pause in the habitual cruelty of dawn. The eagle did not come that day. Zeus had no need of intermediaries. He stood before Prometheus without thunder in his hands, without the trappings of judgment, looking less like a king and more like a figure carved from inevitability. Time had not altered Zeus the way it altered mortals, but it had refined him, sharpened his awareness of erosion. He looked at Prometheus not as an offender, but as a variable that had refused to resolve itself. They regarded one another in silence, two immortal minds shaped by different conclusions drawn from the same universe. Zeus spoke first, his voice even, stripped of accusation. He asked the question that had been circling Olympus for ages, the one no council had dared to frame aloud. Was it worth it? Prometheus did not answer immediately, not because he doubted, but because the question deserved respect. He considered the centuries that had passed, the uncountable dawns marked by pain, the countless nights of regeneration and waiting. He considered the cities that rose and fell, the wars that consumed millions, the art that survived them, the ideas that outlived their creators. He considered the gods' diminishing presence, the way Olympus had receded from command into commentary. He considered the fire still burning, now transformed into forces that reshaped continents and skies. He answered slowly, not with rhetoric, but with precision. Worth, he said, is not measured against comfort. It is measured against possibility. Zeus listened without interruption. Prometheus continued. He said that if the question meant whether humanity had become gentle, the answer was no. If it meant whether suffering had ended, the answer was no. If it meant whether chaos had been eliminated, the answer was no. But if the question meant whether humanity had gained the ability to choose its own direction, to confront the universe with agency rather than submission, then yes. Unambiguously, yes. Zeus's expression did not change, but the air shifted as if the mountain itself leaned closer. He countered that humanity's choices had brought ruin as often as renewal. That fire had accelerated destruction beyond anything the old world had known. Prometheus agreed. Acceleration, he said, reveals character faster. It does not create it. Zeus asked whether Prometheus felt responsible for every atrocity fueled by flame and knowledge. Prometheus did not evade the weight. He said responsibility was not divisible. One either accepts it fully or hides behind authority. He accepted it fully. Zeus was silent for a long time. When he spoke again, there was no anger, only something like fatigue. He said that Prometheus had broken the symmetry of the cosmos, that gods and mortals were no longer separated by inevitability, but by scale, and that scale alone could not sustain reverence forever. Prometheus replied that reverence sustained by fear was not reverence at all, but dependency. Dependency, he said, breeds resentment, and resentment eventually seeks expression. Zeus looked away then, toward the horizon where storms gathered without command. He admitted, quietly, that Olympus had not foreseen the speed of change, that the gods were now reacting rather than shaping, enforcing rather than guiding. He asked whether Prometheus had intended that outcome. Prometheus answered that he had intended uncertainty. Control, he said, is brittle. Uncertainty is resilient. The future belongs to systems that can adapt to questions they did not anticipate. Zeus returned his gaze to Prometheus and asked the question again, softer this time, as if testing whether repetition might yield a different truth. Was it worth it? Prometheus answered with fewer words. The fire still burns. Zeus said nothing. He did not free Prometheus. He did not tighten the chains. He stood there as a god confronted, not with rebellion, but with consequence that could not be reversed without admitting failure. At last, he said that punishment would continue, not as vengeance, but as precedent. Order, he insisted, required symbols. Prometheus nodded. Symbols, he replied, always outlive the intentions that create them. Zeus departed without thunder, leaving the mountain heavier in his absence. The eagle returned the next dawn, and pain resumed its familiar pattern. Prometheus endured it without change in posture, without bitterness. The question had been asked. The answer had been given. That was enough. Worth is not proven by approval. It is proven by persistence. Bound to stone, Prometheus closed his eyes as the sky darkened and thought not of Olympus, not of Zeus, but of a distant world still wrestling with the gift it had been given. Wrestling, he believed, was a sign of life. There are acts that can be reversed, mistakes that can be corrected, paths that allow retreat without consequence. But fire does not belong to that category. Once it has been held, once its language has been learned by hands that were never meant to remain empty, it becomes impossible to pretend the dark is absolute again. Bound to the mountain, Prometheus understood this with a certainty deeper than pain. Zeus could punish a titan for eternity, could scar the edge of the world with chains and ritual suffering, but he could not reach backward through time and close the human mind. Knowledge, once ignited, does not return to the state of ignorance. It spreads, changes shape, disguises itself, but it does not vanish. The gods discovered this slowly, unwillingly, as all entrenched powers do. They issued decrees. They sent omens. They punished cities that grew too bold, kings who forgot to bow deeply enough, thinkers who asked questions without reverence. None of it restored the old silence. Fire had altered the grammar of existence. Mortals no longer asked only what the gods desired. They asked what could be built, what could be changed, what could be resisted. Each question multiplied into others, branching endlessly, forming networks of inquiry no single authority could fully control. Default Text Olympus responded, as institutions always respond when confronted with irreversibility. It attempted management. Zeus did not seek to extinguish fire anymore. He sought to regulate it, to bind it with rules and myths and hierarchies that framed knowledge as divine favor rather than human achievement. Some gods adapted quickly, attaching themselves to new forms of reverence, reshaping their domains to remain relevant. Others withdrew, retreating into older myths, clinging to past glories that no longer commanded the same attention. Prometheus observed these shifts without satisfaction. Adaptation was not vindication. It was inevitability. Below, humanity stumbled forward, uneven and relentless. Fire taught them not only how to create, but how to remember. Records replaced oral memory. Symbols hardened into alphabets. Thought learned how to outlive the thinker. Prometheus felt a strange intimacy with these developments, as if each preserved idea were a quiet echo of the original act that had made preservation possible. Humans argued over meaning with an intensity once reserved for survival. They disagreed, fractured, reunited, and fractured again. They built systems to contain chaos, and then dismantled those systems when they became oppressive. Prometheus recognized the cycle. It was imperfect. It was inefficient. It was alive. The gods, watching from a diminishing distance, mistook chaos for failure. Prometheus understood it as motion. Still bound, still enduring the ritual of pain, he noticed how his own role receded from myth into metaphor. Mortals spoke his name less as history and more as symbol. He became shorthand for defiance, for forbidden knowledge, for the cost of progress. Some praised him, some condemned him. Many misunderstood him entirely. This did not trouble him. Meaning does not require accuracy to function. It requires resonance. Fire continued to burn regardless of how its origin was interpreted. Zeus sensed this erosion most acutely. Authority that cannot retract a change must find ways to coexist with it, and coexistence demands humility power rarely enjoys. The king of gods remained mighty, but his might increasingly took the form of reaction rather than command. Storms answered less to decree and more to necessity. Worship, once reflexive, became conditional. Prometheus saw Zeus struggle not against mortals, but against irrelevance, and understood that this struggle, more than rebellion, was what truly frightened him. Fire had not dethroned the gods. It had displaced inevitability. Bound to the mountain, Prometheus felt the long arc of consequence settle into a form that required no further justification. Even if humanity destroyed itself, even if fire became its undoing rather than its salvation, the act would remain valid. Choice does not guarantee wisdom. It only makes wisdom possible. To deny that possibility is to deny meaning itself. Each dawn, as the eagle returned, Prometheus endured with a calm that bordered on indifference, not because the pain had lessened, but because its significance had. The punishment no longer stood in opposition to his act. It stood beside it, a parallel testament to two competing philosophies of order. Zeus believed obedience could be enforced indefinitely. Prometheus had proven that understanding could not. Fire cannot be untaught. That truth extended beyond flame into every domain it touched. Mortals learned to question, to test, to dismantle explanations that relied solely on authority. Even when they replaced old certainties with new illusions, the habit of inquiry remained. Habits are harder to chain than bodies. As centuries pressed onward, Prometheus accepted that he would not be freed by triumph or remorse. His freedom had occurred the moment he chose coherence over compliance. Everything after that was consequence, not captivity. Bound to stone, he listened to the wind carry fragments of a world that no longer needed him, and felt no bitterness in that realization. A gift fulfilled its purpose when it made its giver unnecessary. When night fell and the fires below continued to glow, Prometheus rested in the quiet knowledge that some lessons, once learned, do not belong to their teachers anymore. Fire had moved on. So had the world. Olympus, whether it admitted it or not, would eventually have to do the same. The end did not arrive with release. Prometheus had never expected it to. Stories favored conclusions that felt like mercy chains falling away, wounds closing forever, the universe acknowledging a lesson learned. But reality, especially divine reality, rarely rewarded coherence with comfort. What ended instead was something quieter and more decisive, the need for resolution. Bound to the mountain, Prometheus understood that a life, even an immortal one, does not require closure to possess meaning. It requires alignment. He had aligned himself with a principle and lived inside its consequences without flinching. That was enough. The world below no longer waited for Olympus to speak. Fires burned in places the gods had never named, illuminating minds that no longer assumed permission was required to think. Humanity argued endlessly about what it should become, inventing futures with the same intensity once reserved for survival. Some futures failed catastrophically. Others endured. None asked the gods for consensus. Prometheus felt that shift not as triumph, but as confirmation. The act had completed itself. Everything after was iteration. Zeus remained king. Olympus still stood. Thunder still answered the raised hand. And yet, something essential had changed. Authority now shared space with explanation. Decree competed with evidence. Fear no longer ruled alone. Zeus felt this imbalance like a hairline fracture running through stone too vast to collapse quickly, but too real to ignore. He ruled still, but with increasing effort, increasing justification. Power that must explain itself has already begun to change. Prometheus sensed that Zeus would never free him, not because the punishment was necessary, but because undoing it would require admitting that punishment had failed to restore the old order. Kings rarely confess to miscalculation. Better to let the Titan remain bound, a relic of defiance safely contained. Zeus did not understand that containment had already failed. Prometheus had never been dangerous because he opposed Olympus. He was dangerous because he demonstrated that opposition could be principled, measured, and enduring. Bound to stone, he did not kneel. Not because he refused submission, but because kneeling would have implied he believed the judgment incomplete. It was complete. He had accepted it fully. The eagle continued its visits. The mountain continued to hold. Pain continued its cycle. None of it altered the equation anymore. Prometheus had moved beyond opposition into irrelevance to power's needs. That was his final victory, though he would never have called it that. He did not desire the gods' downfall. He desired their evolution. Whether they achieved, it was no longer his concern. In the long quiet between dawn and dusk, Prometheus considered the shape of legacy. Mortals would remember him imperfectly. Some would turn him into a hero larger than truth. Others into a warning stripped of context. Both distortions were inevitable. What mattered was not the accuracy of remembrance, but its persistence. His story would survive because it articulated a tension that never resolved. The conflict between control and understanding, between safety enforced and risk embraced. As long as that tension existed, Prometheus would exist within it, not as a being, but as an idea. Ideas do not require freedom to travel. They move through minds, through generations, through crises that demand new answers. Zeus could chain a Titan. He could not chain inquiry. Bound to the mountain, Prometheus listened as the wind carried distant echoes of a world that no longer needed divine permission to burn. He felt no bitterness in that realization. A gift fulfills itself when it outgrows its giver. If humanity destroyed itself, that too would be its choice. Autonomy does not guarantee survival. It guarantees meaning. As night fell again, and fires glowed across the earth, Prometheus rested in the stillness of a decision fully inhabited. He had not sought to rule. He had not sought to save. He had sought to allow. Allowance, he had learned, was the most radical form of faith. The Titan who did not kneel remained bound, not as a failure of rebellion, but as proof that obedience is not the highest virtue a universe can demand. Some acts are done not to be forgiven, not to be celebrated, but to be irreversible. Fire burned. The world continued. Olympus endured, changed, and changing. And Prometheus, chained at the edge of all things, did not ask to be freed, because the moment he chose coherence over compliance, he had already escaped.